It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 38th installment of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. We welcome all past participants back, and of course, we welcome everybody who is new and joining us for the first time. Demy-Colton's mission is about convening healthcare industry leaders to catalyze change. And we do this through our in-person events as well as our virtual events. And they include BioFuture, which is taking place here in New York City in October 4 and 6. Biotech Showcase, which will be held next January next to the JP Morgan conference in San Francisco. Our CEO Summits, invitation-only events taking place in Barcelona this year and in La Jolla in July. Our virtual salon and our virtual salon series, which you're participating in today. And there will be another virtual salon taking place in 2 weeks, so please check back to see what we're doing. The topic of today's salon is market access and valuation, key considerations for multi-indication products. Before we get underway, I do want to thank Lattice Point Consulting again for sponsoring this virtual salon. So thank you, Lattice Point. We will start with a 50 to 55-minute discussion, which will be followed by Q&A. You can enter your questions below your screen, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. Also note that this salon is being recorded and will be available in a few hours for on-demand viewing. Now to today's salon. I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Ted Hack, who is Vice President of Lattice Point Consulting. And Ted will be joined by 4 exceptional panelists, Judy Campagnari, Executive Director and Head, Global Patient Insights and Solutions at Alexion Pharmaceuticals, Elizabeth Jefford, CEO and President of Ilex Therapeutics, Diane Munch, Vice President, International Market Access at Pfizer, who is joining us by phone, Jeannie Rojas, Senior Director at Pfizer, at Worldwide Business Development at GSK. Sorry about that, Jeannie. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to Ted, and everybody will have their right affiliations. I will return during the Q&A session. So Ted, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. It's a great pleasure to be here, and we have an absolutely fantastic panel today. My thanks to Judy and to Jeannie and Elizabeth and Diane for joining us. As you'll hear from them, they have a wealth of background and experience on all sorts of things from clinical development through business development, capital provision, licensing partnerships, et cetera. And so one of the impetus behind this panel was, if you look at how the industry has moved in the last 2 years, the Silicon Valley Bank entries and exits report, and sadly the last one, oncology and platform technology still continue to lead investments and exits. Of course, most of those that by definition means they're multi-indication. If you are on Tim Opler's mailing list, and I highly suggest you do get on it because it's wonderful, he releases a weekly report, and it shows that about 60% of biotechs have a negative enterprise, or pardon me, 60% of biotechs have an enterprise value of less than $100 million US. And consistently, we have 200 life science companies with negative enterprise values. And of those 200, 188 of about 840 biotechs have negative enterprise values. So with that, multi-indications have always required a lot of planning effort and a lot of analysis in order to make really good clinical trial investment decisions and launch decisions. And in the current market, we think that the need is just that much more acute. So as we were discussing and planning this session, we're going to go through a sort of high level and then get into some detail. We know there's a lot of questions of how do I actually do this? We're going to start with investors and diligence and some of the disconnects that we think exist in the market right now. And there's 2 basic disconnects that we started with. And the first is that between investors and fundraising companies. And the second is between science and commercial value. So Elizabeth, as our resident CEO and somebody who's run country operations in Europe and done all sorts of US contracting and is now raising capital, tell us a little bit about some of these disconnects that you're seeing in the market.
the word interesting as a euphemism, but the macros are against us a bit, right, as an industry, politically and economically. And what's been interesting with fundraising for a small company, and we're a near clinical, like I call it, I don't like to call it preclinical because we're pretty close, but you get this sort of a lot of questions about price and access, even as a company that's not even in clinical yet. And so what is funny to me is that you get these questions and it's just like investors want you to have a magical unicorn, right? And I think it reminds me a little bit of like a dating profile when we were all in our 30s and still trying to find love. We want to be first in class, best in class. We want to have no competition, whether it's in development or on market or generic or biosimilars, right? And then they'll ask about like, what's the pricing you can command per month? It's got to be over 10,000, right? Which is just not really feasible for most drugs. It's got to be Medicare, but not IRA Medicare, because that's scary. And it can't be Medicaid. Yeah, exactly. Can't be Medicaid or, God forbid, women's health, right? It can't be small molecules are a bit scarier now than they used to be with the IRA as well. But you want a large number of patients and no market education needed, right? And it's just like, this is an impossible profile to meet. And so often when you're getting these questions, you're sort of saying like, look, this is a good problem to have. If we can get out there with multiple indications, this is the sweet spot of commercial.
So is anyone exempt in the current environment? I mean, from all the discussions you have, from trying to educate them about the quality of your program and what's going on, is there any aha moments where they say, oh, okay, I didn't know that, I didn't understand that? I mean, is it possible?
It is possible. And I think you mentioned oncology companies are taking the wins here for the most part, right? Because there's still this belief that you can do this sort of unlimited pricing, if you will. Rare disease is not. That was the surprise for me when I thought, oh, I'll have a couple of orphans and that will be attractive to an investor. Rare disease and orphans are like that. That's even, people don't even want to talk about it from an investment standpoint, which is really frightening to me. And I think that's where our politicians need to hear this answers. People don't want to invest in it. People don't want to spend the time on it. Not even sure if you get the exclusivity, if you do get to an orphan. So forget the tax benefits and the benefits of working with regulators and the exclusivity benefits, et cetera. Orphan is really out of favor. That was shocking.
Well, and the cherry on the cake is just the other day we got the EU orphan legislation update, which, what we're just about on the 25th anniversary. We'll get into the policy dynamics in a little bit, but that was really quite the cherry on the cake. And I think that's going to have a pretty chilling effect. Jeannie, as our resident capital provider, former writer of synthetic royalties and buyer of clinical stage dynamics, when we were discussing this, you had mentioned, you're also seeing a disconnect between what companies are presenting and the commercial value and what the science can support. What can you tell us a little bit about that disconnect and what you're seeing as you evaluate companies? And we might still have you on mute. No, you're not.
I think you have me on mute.
There you are.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you have me on mute. So I think that companies really need in this funding environment to really be putting their best, foot forward and really putting their efforts into their most promising programs. And so I think that you really, when you're presenting and you're looking for funding, it's important that you have real data to support, a real drug, a real disease, a real data. And so it's important that you really are being realistic about the indications that you're putting forward, not just having a pipeline or having a pipeline of a disease, but the disease, isn't supported by your target and things like that. I really think that you have to put your best, effort forward and really have a promising program with validation and progress that through the clinic.
And on the heels of that, it sounds like that especially this type of audience that we have today, which is typically smaller biotech companies, it sounds like they need to put more effort than they may have historically in terms of justifying some of the commercial value of some of these things. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case, because a lot of times we will be looking at an asset and the company will have a disconnect between what is really going to be happening commercially, whether it's the dosing or whether it's the actual clinical trials that are performed. You know, your clinical trials have to match what your label is going to be. So really, you know, putting that effort to understand what is that commercial environment going to look like for my drug, and doing it early is very important.
Okay.
Ted, can I jump in here?
I was just going to call on you, Judy. Jump on in.
So, I've spent my career in the intersection between science and business. I'm a biochemist with an MBA. And one of the things that I have always said to my colleagues in research and clinical development is great science does not always make a great medicine. And I think that what we are in the business of developing in pharma and biotech are medicines. We're not just developing scientific experiments. And I think, to follow up on what Jeannie was saying, is, you really need to understand not just the environment you're going to put your product in, but what's the medical outcome, the medical benefit you're trying to develop, because the scientific experiments you run to validate that target and to really get confidence that you are blocking the right receptor or that you are reducing the right substrate, if that doesn't translate into an outcome, a benefit, that's where you fall short of the commercial value. So I've seen many times where we get disappointed because scientifically we can prove our concept, but we can't translate that into that outcome that payers are going to be willing to pay for, that doctors are going to say, yes, this is meeting the needs of my patient, and that patients can really understand what they're getting from that medicine. So I think that sometimes is that disconnect.
Yeah, can I jump in too, Ted, on that one? So I spent my formative years at Genentech and Roche, and one of those roles, and I think that's why I'm here, is running pricing and contracting in the US, but also then working in Europe and global. We put commercial people in preclinically way early. I think was the first commercial person on Kadcyla and Perjeta and Tarceva and things like that. And as a small biotech now, as my second small biotech, I get to do that naturally because I have myself. It's not easy to find those people that are commercial and access oriented and bring them into that small biotech environment where you may only have 5 or 10 people total, but it is incredibly valuable. So even if you just could do a target product profile, even in the preclinical and platform stages, what are we trying to change? To your point, Judy, what medically are we going to do differently to make it better for patients or doctors or whoever? Then you can actually start to judge that along the way and say, okay, did I meet that hurdle? Did I meet that hurdle? Did I meet that hurdle? And I think that's really great training if you came from big company to small. But oftentimes, you're right, we're looking at mostly small companies in our universe that are started out by scientists. Having a commercial person in a small company, let alone as a leader of a small company, is very rare.
Yeah, I think everybody on this panel is seen as when you get a pitch deck from a small company, it says, and if we can capture 3% of the market, we'll be so successful. And any of us who have ever launched or negotiated a price in whatever setting, you're like, yeah, that's not how it works, especially in a competitive environment. So part of me says, this is where your independent directors on your board come in, right? Because you don't want to hire a commercial person. It's far too early. But if you have enough science and you have enough of the sort of financial business skills, this is probably where an independent sort of comes in to say, you might need to think about some of these things. Diane, we were talking about this, this is kind of building on the last comments, this sort of logic test and what you're seeing. So, Pfizer has umpteen partnerships, acquisitions, et cetera, and you run a pretty big book of business on the pricing side. So what are your thoughts on all this?
Thanks so much, Ted. And thanks everyone for the questions coming through the chat and the discussion. And it's interesting listening to the commentary and then thinking about what I consider at Pfizer and what we generally think about. And just a quick preface, I spent 25 years of my pharma career in finance, commercial, and strategy roles. I'm the head of international market access at Pfizer, so see the entire book of business across the world. And I generally start with a mix of a science lens and a geography lens. To say, where is the unmet need? Where is the patient outcome? Is our biggest market going to be the US? Is our biggest market going to be Brazil? And that also really helps me steer to think about what are the policy challenges ahead of me? What does the competition look like? Ted, I think to your point, are you going to have 3% share? Is that 3% share going to be in the US or is it going to be in Bulgaria? What, thinking 5 years down the road, and where do I want to make an investment? And so I really do. And one of the things, and this is kind of a hard fought over the years, assume that 3 to 5 years from now, your price is going to be plus or minus 35 to 40% of what you think it is today, and assume that your volume is going to be plus or minus 20% of what you think it is today, and start really looking at your scenarios and make some decisions on the viability of your worst case scenario. And you never want to be the person saying no, but if you're thinking about Judy's point on science for the science, your role as the access leader is to come in and say, hey, CEO, you've got to think about a lot of different factors.
Well, and to your point, it's by indication.
Yeah. It's by indication. Are you looking at, and it's interesting because as we look at oncology combinations and, doublets and triplets, we may have one of the products we're trying to partner with 2 others. They may have zero interest in partnering with us. Mm-hmm. How do we think about that? So these are all of the considerations we take into account when we're thinking about value and when we're thinking about how do we price across the world so that the medicine lands in the hands of the patients that need it, yet it also delivers value, particularly if we're partnering with a company that has 1 or 2 products.
Other people's thoughts. Elizabeth, you're smiling.
I'm smiling a little bit. I love that you said, Diane, we don't like to say no. The thing is, right, companies are in the business of selling, right? We have to sell all the time. Little companies are selling, trying to find money, trying to find partners, trying to find belief in KOLs, whatever it is. And when you're going through diligence is an audit, right? Diligence is by definition something where people are trying to find the little problems and spot them, right? And say no. So that's what I laughed at a little bit. I mean, you should be getting used to no's if you're living in biotech. In 2023.
If you're not, congratulations.
Yes. And there's some point where you just have to believe, right? Like there's there's people that will tell you, don't do this in infectious disease, or don't do this for that, or don't, this is the thing that's on the market today is just fine, works just fine. And at some point you have to have belief. You have to have passion to say, nope, there is a better way. There's so many markets where we've looked at things and sort of said, is this good enough? Right? In breast cancer, was adriamycin good enough? Heck no. Yeah. Right? So we had to keep going. But that's an easier path in oncology. But if you have something in respiratory or dermatology or, ophthalmology, where I am, which is very tough, you do have to believe and just say, look, this will make a difference. And here's the target product profile. And here's the pricing plan. And here's my model. And if you do have those facts, you're still going to get no's. So that's okay, right? You just need to find enough people to say yes. to
But
keep it rolling.
let me,
Judy.
yes. So let me put on my current hat. You know, my previous role at Alexion, I led Alexion's new product strategy business development team. So I was the commercial lead on all of our mergers and acquisitions. My new role, I lead a team which is part of our patient advocacy organization. So I spend my day talking to patients, caregivers, doctors, payers, all from the perspective and the question of understanding what does the patient need from us and how do we deliver that? How do we solve problems for patients? Because I think that as we are trying to understand how do we get to that yes, one of the major voices in that conversation has got to be the patient and the caregiver. Even in primary care and specialty care. I mean, for rare disease, it's extremely important because, you know, rare disease, it's rare because you don't have a lot of doctors, even specialists, who will understand the condition, the disease, and that life. So the patient is the expert. But even now, I see in specialty care and in primary care, hearing from that patient and having them articulate what their lived experience is, that helps you really crystallize the yes you're trying to do. Because one of the things that, and I'll be honest, frustrates me when I have been in business development conversations is a company who's coming forth basically saying, we have this wonderful idea for this disease. But again, it's all from their internal perspective of what is needed. Or it's really from a very clinical place, and it's not focusing on the life of that patient or the life that caregiver has for the patient, and really crystallizing that lived experience and getting to the what is it that they want and they need from us, biotech pharma. I think that helps to crystallize that target product profile and the value. And just one more thing I'll say is it's interesting to me to see the 21st Century Cures Act here in the United States and the EMA scientific guidance to 2025 be implemented. And I'm seeing an increasing number of my colleagues from across the organization who are coming and saying, you know, we're being asked, what is the patient saying? And how are they really their needs reflected in our protocol, in our filings. And so I think that's a good thing. And I'm really excited to see that because I think, to your point, Elizabeth, we've really got to get to that yes. And part of that yes is understanding the patient.
Jeannie, your thoughts? Can we get a mute again? Oop. Sarah, do we have, Jeannie, we may have a mute issue. While we work out the technical issue, one of the things we talked about, especially this multi-indication, and Elizabeth, you threw this out, and I think all of us have had some experience, is there is a lower interest in rare and orphan right now. Which is pretty fascinating. It's, you know, coming from a place like Genzyme, coming from a place like Pfizer, we had some bolt-on rare diseases, right? Lipitor had HoFH in its label, these sorts of things. What are people doing? I mean, Judy, you're you know, one of the meccas of rare diseases. Like, what are you seeing? Because we talked about there's OpEx differences when you look at things. Just certain of these indications, there's a little bit of, do you know what it takes? On the heels of your last comment and vis-a-vis the patient community and docs and KOLs. And then there's, hey guys, if you're going into a more general population drug, specialty primary care, all of a sudden you're out of the MSL business back into the sales rep business. So Judy, talk to me, just finish up your thoughts on how that's shaken out.
Yeah, so I'll start off by saying that, and this is my perspective based on my experience, the rare disease market is not for the faint of heart. You know, a company that wants to get into rare or that is in rare, there's a lot of no's that you have to get comfortable with, and not just no in terms of pricing and access, not no in terms of partnerships, potential partnerships, but no's in terms of the development pathway. It is a very challenging place because unlike well-established and highly populous diseases, a lot of the data that we would use to drive decisions, a lot of the literature that helps us identify the appropriate biomarker or the appropriate target or mechanism that would be really productive and deliver that medical and clinical benefit, that's an evolving area for many of the rare diseases. And I forget what the statistic is. I mean, I think there are over 9,000 rare diseases and less than 5%
The old
of them.
stat was 7,000 and it's gone up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's gone up. Yeah, so don't quote me on the statistic, but let's just say there are thousands of rare diseases and less than a small percent of those actually have approved therapies. Having said that, I do think that there is great value for really focusing in on rare. However, there's a cautionary tone, which is when I started with Alexion in 2014, there was, I think, a general assumption that because there is such a high unmet need in rare, that you can price whatever you want. That, the pricing world is your oyster because patients will do whatever, doctors will do whatever if they have a rare disease patient or they live with a rare disease. And for many reasons, not just socioeconomic or financial, but for many reasons, that's not, in my experience, a true outcome or a true scenario. Patients are not going to do whatever. There is still a threshold for demonstrating value for that patient, for making sure that your therapy, your medicine is really has the appropriate risk-benefit ratio. And I think that it's important that as you're thinking about and developing in rare, to really still keep to our basic tenets. What's your objective clinically? What are the needs clinically, medically, and what value are delivering? That calculus is still going to be done. If you are trying to deliver amelioration of a morbidity or slow progression or stop progression, if that's what you're able, that's got to be in the context of then, therefore, what the value is you're creating from a pharmacoeconomic perspective. So I think that rare disease is not a panacea for creating financial value, revenue, because we still are having the same conversations that I saw in primary care and specialty care here in rare.
I think the other thing is the ugly topic of pricing, right? Where we know, and Diane brought this up, when you think geographically, the price levels aren't there. I mean, even in oncology, right? The price of Keytruda in Europe versus the US I think it's a tenfold difference. I haven't looked at it in a year or so, but it's double digits if I remember correctly.
Yes, Ed, we actually take a lot of look at the deltas between the U.S. and rest of world, and oncology is easily in the 10 to 12 range across the board. Yeah,
and it's it's funny. I have two sort of comments that people made to me when I switched from the big business, multi-billion-dollar companies, Genzyme and Pfizer, to smaller early stage ones. And I talked to Barbara Dalton at Pfizer Ventures when I first started doing this, and she said, we invest so early, and you as a operations guy need to think about this. We invest so early, we don't even know if it's going to get out of the Petri dish. So I'm not really, sure I need all this commercial evaluation. And I think she has a very fair point. But, as Elizabeth highlighted, being in the ocular space or in oncology, there's so many high quality drugs out there that competition has come about, right? Ergo price pressure. And all of a sudden, I find myself constantly looking at small companies, and I'm like, are you so early that this is not today's problem or next week's problem? Or are you simply going into a competitive space, wet AMD, non-small cell lung cancer, right? That all of a sudden, guys, you probably need a more stronger commercial assessment by tumor type or by indication or what have you.
Well, I think this is kind of why we see platform companies go in and out of favor, right? And it does this, it does a sine wave, and people will say that right now platform is out of favor. But if you look at who's getting investments and that sort of thing, it looks more like platform, because sometimes it's easier to believe in the early promise than it is when you actually have the drug and you're starting to look at these life cycle plays and say, how do they stack up, right? So I do think, you see some of the advanced technologies, gene and cell therapy, lots of investment, right? Radio oncology, huge investment space right now. Certainly CRISPR, Cas9, there's like 9 companies doing it, right? Like there's so many things around the advanced technologies, because if I go back to my perfect husband analogy, this is like you and your 7-year-old, in your bedroom with your Barbies, like going like, someday my prince will come is a lot easier to believe than, and that was just really insulting to everyone with advanced technologies. But I mean, it is, let's be honest. The fact is, like, there's a difference between having something that is a possibility and something that is lying in that early clinical valley of death, right? Where you know what it is and you know the target product profile and you know some of the warts of what they'll be up against commercially. So I don't think, Ted, that you can just sort of say like, oh, we're just going to step back from it and ignore it for now. I think that as soon as you get into the clinic or start to name indications, you better be ready to answer the questions.
Yeah. And I don't know if Jeannie's, if we fixed her technical problem, but it's, we know, and we had this discussion planning, is at some point in the valuation model, the acquirer or the capital provider is basically putting a 0 as a dummy variable next to certain indications, right?
Absolutely.
Basically saying, I don't believe it. Right?
Probably most of them.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So often we'll be looking at a company and they have a lead program, but then they have several other programs that are frankly just distractors. There's no clinical validation. There's really no reason to believe that there will be any technical or regulatory success. So we'll put essentially a $0 value on that indication. But to chime in what other people are saying also about, understanding your commercial landscape early, I think it's so important because you should really start thinking about, your valuation before you even start developing the drug. Think critically about the competition, the line of therapy, what trials to perform, will it be reimbursed?
Yeah. And one of the dynamics that's coming out, and I know this came in some of the early questions, is, well, I do have an orphan and I do have, a more general population drug. What do I do? And the very simple answer is, you try to insulate it somehow, which is typically a manufacturing farm-side formulation solution. And my question is, are you the PCSK9s, right, which did not do $150,000, 80,000 euro prices for HoFH, right? They didn't. We didn't do that. Pfizer, which is dated, but more modern PCSK9. Or are you Apellis, which was able to, sepulate from a formulation perspective, the ocular versus the rare disease. And that's kind of the answer. So if you can't do that, you're really going to struggle. And then you still have to do all the trials and that, right? So there's still all this development cost. Let's shift gears because we also know this is a pretty spicy topic from some of the questions that came in. Let's talk about policy change and things like IRA. We have the good fortune of Diane and Elizabeth are both involved in the DC crowd, and not just the cocktail party side. Diane, tell us a little bit from pharma and Pfizer's public statements, what you're seeing about the IRA. Is it the end of the world? Are we all going to die because of the IRA, or is it there's a little bit more nuance to it?
Thanks so much, Ted. Thanks. So obviously leading question there, and I will take the nuanced answer for 100 and think a little bit about breadth and depth. And if you look at the IRA, ultimately, this is, we think about all of the potential legislative proposals that could have come our way. The IRA, in looking at Part D benefit redesign, hopefully has a benefit for the patient. When we think about that and we think about the $35 insulin cap, when we think about caps on patient out of pocket, there are some real tangible benefits there. There are also some challenges to get through, and it becomes one of those things that if you're looking at, the three main provisions of the IRA, thinking about Medicare negotiation, inflation-based rebates, and Part D redesign, ultimately to understand the impact and your position in the world, it's really thinking a little bit about where you play. Is it big primary care product that's likely to be one of the top 5 products in U.S. sales? Is it an orphan? Are you a vaccine? Are you in that particular unicorn of, rare disease oncology vaccine?
PD vaccine, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you the true? So I think back to Elizabeth's point, if we're thinking a little bit about the true unicorn, are you a unicorn or are you a big primary care player? And the impact is going to be different. And one of the things, we've taken an incredibly granular look at our pipeline to say these are, across our pipeline, the puts and takes that we would anticipate from IRA. And I think the thing, from an overall perspective, it's not great. It's not terrible. We're working through it. Pharma is definitely putting out talking points on behalf of the industry. The industry, though, from an early assessment, I saw potential legislation, and this is an interesting point when we talk about the deltas between U.S. and international prices. 5-6 years ago, when we potentially had price referencing on the table of countries in emerging markets, I saw an assessment, I think from a consulting firm, that, industry could lose across the top 86% of its revenue. That's kind of a non-starter. So when you put IRA in that context, it's something we have to navigate. We have to be really, really thoughtful as we bring products forward. Understand where our revenue is. Are they primarily the Medicare population? Where do we anticipate playing? So I would say it's not ideal, but it's not 86% off the top line either.
Right.
And I don't remember who put that statistic out, but I remember it just raised alarm bells, as you can imagine.
Yeah, there was a couple people who killed programs pretty quick, and I'm thinking, you were probably going to kill that anyway, and now you're just blaming USG for being fat, drunk, and ugly.
Right.
As opposed to actually ran the numbers.
Yeah, and that's where, if you are a unicorn, your navigation through the IRA probably isn't going to be that difficult.
Yeah.
I think the EU package that's up for comment, because presumably you want to sell your unicorn in more than just the U.S. I think the EU package that's up for comment with the changes in exclusivity, the proposal about patent lifespan, about multi-indications, about head-to-head clinical trials and comparators. I actually think, and ideally the European Union might say a lot of us go to market suboptimally with a single-arm trial. But I do think this will make things a little bit more challenging, particularly if you are looking at how you spread your dollars for your investment. If you have only 1 or 2 products to bring to market, in terms of how you deploy your resources, I think it actually makes it a lot tougher for the EU. That's just my perspective.
So let's come back to the EU, because that's a little bit new. Let's come back to that in a second. Elizabeth, you're with Bio Emerging Companies team. So tell us a little bit about what you're all talking about.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm on the Bio board, so I'm not speaking for Bio, obviously, but just my perspective on what has been bounced around is the IRA was obviously, it's one of multiple issues going on right now. And I'll come back to it in a second. But there's also the sort of NOLs and the tax credits that are expiring that are a big deal for small companies, because you could end up having revenue that is taxed when you don't actually have any revenue, which is a sort of a strange situation for us. There's also then everything going on with the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine v. FDA, which is, obviously a bit of a political topic, but it becomes important because you have you sort of have rogue judges attacking the FDA. So we actually just, between the CEO Sisterhood and which is a wonderful group of female CEOs in biotech, but also working with Bio and Pfizer and a number of others who've signed on to it. I think we have up to about 350 people now on amicus briefs saying, look, the FDA should be the only arbiter for whether something's safe and effective in the US, period. And so we hope that that argument stays present. But I think it's interesting because it's, as a biotech CEO, not only do you have to know about pricing and access and commercial, you also have to start to know about policy and be involved in it, right? And IRA was one of those things that you have to know, even just to be able to say, like, oh, don't worry, I'm not Medicare, or, I'm something like that, whatever your song and dance is on that sale. It's pretty important for all the reasons that Jeannie just said, but also because there's no way to comment on it, right? Usually when you have a government pricing rule, you have the 30, 60, 90 days to comment, and then you'd get the final rule and you could still comment on that. This was sort of out there. It just came, and the small molecule versus large molecule is a big deal because we all know that oftentimes small molecules are more attractive for patients. Right. So 9 versus 13 years, that was a little bit insane. But also, even just what you were talking about, Ted, that one of the benefits of having different formulations and being able to put things in different classes, say this is a different drug, is that you can price them differently or sort of commercially market them differently. If the IRA has some of this strange language around sort of what is bona fide competition, and will that be knitted into this is a really open question. And I think we have to be aware of that and be a little bit nervous about that. So I think, in terms of the IRA and whether people are sort of up in arms about it, I'd go a little bit more worried than Jeannie maybe as a small company, but just because people are worried. It was one more thing to throw on the pile, right? SVB and First Republic was worrisome. IRA was worrisome. The tax credits are worrisome, right? These are just macros against the industry. And there's other countries out there, China namely, had put a 5-year policy out there to become the world biotech innovation leader. So U.S. is in a situation, honestly.
I'm doing a panel on cyber risk tomorrow. If you want to join that, we'll tell you why you shouldn't put your IP there. But
if the U.S. cares about having innovation, biotech's pharma was one of the last great U.S. sources of innovation. If the U.S. cares about it, we're not really going about in the right way to preserve it in the best sense.
I want to pick up on.
So interesting, Elizabeth. I was actually just going to say China, with all of the plays that they've been making, presents a really, really interesting position for us.
Yeah.
And Ted, I know you wanted to jump in, but happy to chat about China at any point.
Also just the need to, can I just say, like, get involved too, because, like, one of the best things I've ever heard from an investor was somebody said, there's Peter Kulczynski at RA has a great group called No Patient Left Behind, and they're working on IRA. So besides bio and pharma and everybody else, there's also an industry wave. One of the things that's in there is hospitals don't go generic, right?
What?
Yes, hospitals don't go generic. We don't control hospital costs. Right now, maybe we get some of the pharmacy benefit manager legislation rolling, but hospital costs just continue to go up, right? I had an appendectomy where I did not stay overnight this last year, $78,000 in the U.S.
Nice.
Yes, nice. And it was over 14 months ago, and they just sent me another bill for $4,000.
Good Lord.
So where's the hospital? 3 years ago, we still get invoices. So let's ignore our personal pain. I want to pick up on 2 things. And Elizabeth, you just mentioned one of the big things, especially as the scientific founder of the science community that's starting companies. Good on you for that. Learn about policy, right? That's a lot of the reasons why the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine came about. It's because in many senses, they were neither here nor there vis-a-vis pharma, bio, et cetera. And I started working with them 7 or so years ago. And, you had a lot of people, basic point, obviously defending their own technology, right? Of course, right? That's what you're there for. And then there was also a vibe of, yeah, but hey, all the big companies are there and we'll just let them do it. And I said, well, they're doing the same thing. They're going to protect their onco or their rare or the primary care, whatever it happens to be. So if you're okay inheriting their policy and portfolio desires, wonderful. You just save yourself a few hours. But I don't think that's very good anymore. So this whole, you got to learn about commercial and policy. I also want to come back to picking up on some of Diane's comments. Actually, really all of her comments thus far, is historically, the business concept is investing in staged options, right? Do a smaller trial, a lower cost trial, get a bit of proof of concept and function.
Fourth line, fifth line,
right?
yeah.
Right. And that's where the rares came out, right? That's why we looked at Crohn's first with the anti-TNFs, and that's why we did all sorts of things. And, my takeaway from a lot of the conversation today is we're almost saying you got to turn that on its head because of the aversion to some rare and orphan. And so, Jeannie, how would you tell people to do as an investor? What are you sort of telling people now, or what do you think would be the best way?
I mean, what I'm telling people right now is that you really have to put your best efforts into your most promising programs and really push them through the clinic. I mean, if you think about, for example, an asset that's in phase 1 versus an asset that does make it to phase 2, the valuation is significantly different. So I think that it's really important to focus on having targets that have some clinical validation so that you can tell the story about why this drug is going to work in this indication and progress it forward, I think, as opposed to trying to have several programs and trying to tell a story about each one of them.
Yeah, so technical risk is still the primary risk, if you like.
Yep.
Yeah, just to add to that, Ted, I think just to follow up on Jeannie said, I mean, when you've got a candidate or a molecule that could go after a number of different indications, the best way you can position yourself is to have data that demonstrates the scientific concept and the potential medical benefit. Because a company that's going to come in and either want to partner with you or want to get a license to that molecule or even acquire it is trying to answer the question of, can this dog hunt? Is there some reason scientifically to believe that this is an active molecule? And in the indications where that molecule, that target, that mechanism may be relevant, what data do I have? Because in my experience, and I've been involved in business development for the better part of 15 years, when you're looking and assessing a molecule, that company that you're either partnering with or that is looking to license or acquire your asset is not looking at your data to say, this is great, this is what I'm getting. They're looking for that future potential, and they very may well change the plan, particularly if that molecule's got a patent life on it, if they can get partnership with you or license with you early enough where they have the benefit to do additional studies. So what you're presenting is not just your data and for that one indication or multiple indications, but really the veracity of the mechanism and how that mechanism and how that molecule really pans out across different diseases. So the best thing you can do is to pick an indication that is scientifically relevant and there's a high confidence and you really feel good about proving the mechanism and proving that concept.
Right. And the one of the things we're sort of tiptoeing around, but we've talked a little bit about geography, is I think more and more we're still looking at selective launches, right? We may not launch in every geography, whether it's Asia, whether it's Eastern Europe, what have you, and forget all the war-torn countries and U.S. Treasury list type countries. Yeah. And I think that's one of the items, Judy, you'd mentioned a little bit ago, this, and we've seen this, God, for decades, the over-reliance on U.S. pricing, right? Yeah. And I think when you get into partnership things, we have a lot of companies say, I'm going to do my home country, whether that's the US, UK, Europe, what have you, and I'm going to partner out the other one. And I think, as you start dividing up your product, whether you say, well, I'm going to do certain indications, I'm going to do certain geographies, to me, that's becoming less attractive. I don't know if you ladies agree with that. You know,
Less
meaning
attractive
if you're
to
only
one?
throwing me one part of the world, like Europe,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I'm going to do that commercial assessment, and a lot of times it's not worth the squeeze. So agree, disagree, Elizabeth?
Yeah, you're going to get into European policy. Well, we probably won't.
That's where I'm
because we
trying to
don't
go.
have time, but, you know, living in Europe and having launched products in Europe and I waited 2.5 years fighting with the sort of a Scandinavian country for approval for, I think, 4 women for an oncology drug. So that is not something you can do lightly. You need a whole team to do it. And launching in one country is launching in one country. So I think we do. I'm still guilty of doing here's the US plus a multiple.
Oh, no.
Come on, we have like 10 people.
Elizabeth.
I make my own model
Just
still.
tore
Okay,
my
I'm
heart
like,
out.
I know. I'm a CEO with, but also like our manager of commercial analytics. So it's one of the many hats. We can only do so much.
No, I think you're right, Ted. I think that there's been a lot of conversations I've seen, not just I'm not speaking for my company here, but just as I look at some of the deals I've seen that are being done. It's hard to think about global launches. When you consider European reference pricing, when you
No
consider
VC wants to do a global launch, right? Fact.
Well, you want to sell it or partner it before then, right? That's not.
You're trying to. You want a cash exit, right?
Yeah, global launches, I think, are hard now, and not just from a pricing and reference pricing perspective or access, but also just some of the distribution challenges and the policy challenges that are happening now. So I think that thinking that you're going to carve off a country for yourself and then sell the rest, that conversation I'm seeing increasingly not viable.
Yeah, Judy, it's a really interesting point when you think about global launches and the challenges and generally to conduct a launch globally. We are still seeing countries that we're launching Ibrance, and we launched in the US in 2015. So 8 years later, we're still concluding that launch cadence. And I think if you think about the resources it takes from regulatory to policy, manufacturing, distribution, and then actually having the commercial network and having the in-country organization that can handle all of these, it's a really big endeavor. That being said, for the right medicine at the right time, it's something you absolutely want to aspire to.
Yeah.
And I do think, when you're, and Elizabeth, it's an interesting perspective. I might argue and say, oh, wow, we need more precision once we're down to a real pricing policy. But at valuation, I see nothing wrong with doing a multiplier.
Yeah.
I think it's the most efficient way to do it. Yeah.
Well, the one thing underneath your comments, Diane, for the rest of the audience is, okay, you're talking about an 8-year launch cycle at a behemoth like Pfizer. Underneath those 8 years, you've renegotiated once or twice in a variety of countries.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? And people need to appreciate that, like, it's not just static. Hooray, I launched and revenue starts crawling in. No, your price is going to erode.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things on access, particularly if you're looking at new indications, assume, I say this in jest, but assume the 20% decline. I also think one of the things, we face is with every country having their own pricing legislation and cost containment measures in place post-COVID, whereas we might have seen you've got 3 to 5 years before you'll have to renegotiate. Sometimes now that's 12 months. The renegotiation cycle is starting earlier. The cost containment methods are becoming tougher. So it's also the thought that you're bringing your unicorn to the world. The world is still in a post-COVID haze.
Yeah.
And I think that's, one of the pressures we just have to be very, very realistic about.
Yeah. We're about to switch to Q&A. I wanted to sort of summarize our discussion for the audience, but Jeannie, any other thoughts from you before we shift gears?
No, nothing for me now.
Okay, cool. So there's a few questions in the pre-read, and obviously we've had a pretty wide discussion here. I wanted to summarize it, and how do you actually plan for all this stuff? And a couple of people, and I used to do this at one of my old companies, we had a concept called real win worth, right? Is the opportunity real? Can my technology actually address it by indication? Can we win? And my shearing plow days, winning meant no less than second in the market. So no matter how many entries, and I was in antihistamines and dermatologicals, a lot of entries, you had to be one or two. And lastly, is it worth the investment? What's the amount of money we have to invest in clinical trials to assure high quality patient access at the payer level, right? So there's docs, there's patients, and we're talking payer. And so in order to do this at a high level, indication strategy review, we started the day. What's the horsepower of the product by indication? What are the outcomes? How do they compare to your competition? Do I have to do additional studies or include additional endpoints to make payers happy? Competition, right? Standard of care may be crap, but it's been used for a while, so you got to look at that. What's the evolution of emerging competitors, both novel as well as generics, biosimilars? All that competitor review. Then we step over to pricing. What are the price points by product, by indication of all these things? And this gets into things like mandatory discounts, negotiation, renegotiation, as we just highlighted. For the US, you would do a book of business analysis, right? How many of these patients are commercial versus Medicare versus Medicaid? Are you PD? Are you elderly? All sorts of things. And then this orphan dynamic, which we mentioned a few moments ago, can you actually insulate it? And based on all of that, you're going to come down to what I would call is your anchor indication, right? That's the queen bee. Everybody else, every other indication is effectively going to fall on its sword to protect this lead anchor indication. Everything else then becomes clear. So this gets back to the comment a few minutes ago of, are you just tucking in the orphan indication a la the PCSK9s and many other products, or are you doing something like what Apellis was able to do by separating the product via formulation or other insulation? So that's a very high level, and the answer is it depends on your product and your technology, but I wanted to summarize that for the audience because I know a lot of questions had come through. And with that, I will thank my fabulous panelists, and we'll switch over to Sarah.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Ted. This is such a complicated topic. The only way to really navigate through it, as an outsider looking in, is when you have super experienced people that have been there and done that before. So thank you very much. And as indicated by the complexity of some of the questions that we've gotten, let's see what we can get through. Judy, first of all, someone is congratulating you on your daughter's graduation. They were there too.
Thank you. Go blue.
We'll let you know who they are after. Okay.
Yes, I'll give them a big go blue.
Yeah, and I'll try to get through as many of these as we can. One question from another pharma company is, I'm curious how we should think then about designing a clinical program to deliver a multi-indication asset with recognition of risk, time, costs, and sales. Ted, speaks to you.
I think I just answered that.
I think so.
No, in all sincerity, it's there. You have to chop some wood before, right? You really have to. One of the best outcomes of a market access analysis is getting the clinical and the commercial side to reconcile, right? Because the clinical and the regulatory dynamics are like, this is what we need to get a label, to get approved. The market access is, this is what we need to sell money and get operating cash flow, right? And so to bridge those things. So you have to chop a bit of wood of, right, what's the plan? And Judy, actually, I think everybody made the comment, but Judy highlighted specifically of what's the patient outcome and how high a quality an outcome is that by indication. right? Then you're going to go through some of the different things of what is the competition look like. The number of times people come in and say, wow, I have a great product and this is all the wonderful things you can do. And you say, what about the competition? And they say, well, we don't really know, or we can beat them. And, there's a lot of people who try to take on the 800-pound gorilla and lose. So that competitive dynamic has to occur. And then after that, like I said, your lead indication is going to fall out. Based on that, the indications that follow on that would be, I'll say, supportive or at least not erosive, that's kind of your clinical package. Any of them that are erosive, you may need to deprioritize. There may be a patient component to some of that, where some patient communities may be looking for you because you're the only game in town on that. And that's some discussion, but it's a big strategic assessment review. Ladies, thoughts from you all? Agree, disagree?
So, no, I agree. And I was actually reflecting on some of the things you want to think about as you're valuing the indications and valuing which indications is, don't think about a commercial assessment as a finite experience. Commercial valuation should really flow in flux with where your molecule is in development. When I was working with our research scientists here at Alexion and in my former life at Pfizer, one of the very first questions I would ask them is, okay, so you've got this target, you've got this mechanism, and it's going to do what? And the answer is not, well, it's going to, block this receptor. That's great. But by blocking the receptor, what do you get? And so what I was trying to understand is, what does the patient look like if they are successfully treated? Because then you can start putting some what we used to say, back of the envelope calculation together. That upfront calculation you're going to do when you've got a preclinical or phase 1 candidate is very different than what you're going to do later on when you get to phase 2, phase 3. In phase 1, you're really trying to understand, is it worth it, to Ted's earlier point. In phase 2, 3, when you're running that financial analysis, that commercial valuation, now you're starting to put a lot more meat on the bone. Now you're asking questions about operating expenses. You're talking about, how much is it going to cost me? And is the revenue that I could potentially take in and the expenses I'm going to have in order to support this medicine in the market, does that result in a bottom line profit? That's that valuation. But before you can get there, and what I always like to do in terms of identifying which is the indication to be your queen bee, it's really got to be that question of, because of what this product, future medicine, could do, here is the revenue, here is the potential value of that. And that really helps you, I think, get it into that earlier conversation. Because I saw one of the questions of, when's the right time to do evaluation? Do evaluation as early as possible. But again, it's a different kind of an assessment and evaluation depending on where that asset is.
It's not the full Magdaddy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask that too. I mean, yes, do the valuation early, do it with the multiple. Although, Ted, don't worry, I have pricing going like this, right?
You're killing me, Elizabeth.
But the other thing is reality for small companies. You're going to be, absolutely, you should have an anchor. You're going to need some hooks along the way. So agree with Judy, you have to have those early studies that are just proof of concept. Does this thing work at all? Right? Does it do what I said it did? And then you can really start to fly around sort of what can it do versus competition, et cetera. Those early studies may be slightly different. Ideally, we would do absolutely the right comparative studies from the beginning, but sometimes you do need to just sort of check in and do some little, like I talk about anchors and hooks, right? You have the hooks to be catalysts along the way so that you can keep people engaged, that you can know that something's happening, that you can start to show value.
Yeah, I think that the one thing underneath it all is risk mitigation, right? I mean, I'm an auditor by training and an audit committee. So there's certain risks we have to accept. So to your point, Elizabeth, if you got $100 in the bank, guess what? That's the biggest trial we can do.
That's right.
Yes.
May not be the optimal one, but it's going to get us somewhere, and then we're going to have to go. So it's not risk avoidance, it's risk mitigation, and they're different.
Prioritization.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, you know what, Elizabeth, you bring up a really good point, because one of the things that always impressed me when I was in deal discussions was a company that came in and said, here's what we've done. If we had more money, here are the studies we would do. Because it really is great to say, okay, where would you go next?
Yes.
And one
And
of
that's
the
why we're talking to
studies
you.
that ad, but that was always that always really helped. That really helps to focus in, because you're not trying to do it all and say, look at all the stuff we've done. Aren't you impressed?
We have 99 options.
Everybody likes focus.
I do want to interject here. We just had a rather cute comment come in. One of our viewers said, "Does Judy have direct access to heaven? The light above her head looks like it could be a conduit to higher sympathies." So
it sounds like the family's on the line.
it doesn't look
So
like it's a
that's a
family
weird
name.
view.
So you've got a magical connection there, Judy.
I guess. Anybody want anything from God?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, let's ask. Okay, so let's go on to some other questions.
I want to keep developing drugs for patients that work. How about that?
I do need to let you know, Elizabeth, there is an investor who is asking you a whole bunch of questions.
Oh, okay.
So,
well, if they're interested in investing in ophthalmology, they should absolutely give me a call.
Yeah.
We'll share that information with you afterwards. So for some of the viewers, you've asked some questions are very long and complicated. I will share this with Ted and everybody else so that we can get back to you and answer a little bit more in depth to your questions. But let me go on to asking. One of the questions is, so are investors interested in drugs that would not be hampered by IRA? So maybe Elizabeth, what do you think?
Yes, I think investors are still interested in both if you can figure out the right story, right? But it's just you do have to get over that hurdle of saying, gulp, I'm a small molecule. Let me tell you why you shouldn't be worried about IRA from my situation. So, or gulp, I have an orphan, and I was hoping to do more than one orphan indication. That one, the small molecule one, is a little easier to sell right now than the orphan piece, which is just a crying shame. To my ask for heaven is that we can keep developing drugs that help patients. Like that's a bit funny.
Well, I don't know if we can put odds on it, but as you and Diane both highlighted, the industry and a few hundred people, right, and a few hundred company names are all going after the small molecule exception, which is a really bad piece of policy. But the 9 versus 13 and some other things, like, people are working on it. When will it get done? Don't know, right? We still have to reconcile the budget on the act to do that. But it's I wouldn't just say it's a done deal.
I think the concern was it could have been worse, right? I forget who said that, but it could have been worse. So
Russian optimism, today may be bad, but tomorrow will be worse. Exactly.
Okay. So another viewer has asked, how do you convince a partner to partner with you if you have some good animal data and some evidence of clinical effect, but an unknown mechanism?
Ooh.
Jeannie?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, this happens all the time. And I mean, I can think of so many diseases where the animal model, like let's say lung fibrosis, the animal model just doesn't tell us realistically what will happen in the clinic. So I think it's pretty challenging if you're trying to tell this story of, I have an animal model, I've got some data. I mean, in this environment, people really want to see clinical data. I mean, especially in this funding environment where there's actually a lot of dry powder out there, but it's really those pristine programs that are getting the investment. So I think it's challenging. Maybe in certain diseases, you have animal models that are more predictive, but in a lot of diseases, and there's been a lot of papers written on this subject where the animal models, they serve their purpose, but it doesn't always translate to what's in the clinic.
Yeah, an old
Judy,
Genzyme
would you ever
colleague of mine
consider-
made an go ahead, Judy.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask Jeannie a follow-up, which is, would you consider a phased deal where, you go in with initial pool of money to fund, to invest in that molecule, and then milestone payments along the way. Because, I mean, as you said, that happens all the time. And for a small company that's trying to progress to get that in human mechanism-related data, would you consider that kind of a deal?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if you look at the funding environment right now, in general, upfront payments are down, but milestones are increasing. So I think that would definitely be a strategy that you could use. And another thing, it's more, license your programs out as opposed to trying to take them all the way, through the clinic yourself in this funding environment.
Yeah, you're really looking for partners who have a pure discovery bent. So you really shrank the target in terms of possible partners. I guess the one comment I always think about when I see people shopping such programs around is an old Genzyme colleague. He said, look, we have great mouse models, but a lot of people can cure mice. It's curing humans that's difficult. And so I think that bias is just really difficult to get past, especially in today's environment, unless you can do some of the things that Jeannie was just mentioning.
Okay, thank you. So one of our viewers has asked about licensing out to China as a single country, and then partnering in the US and the EU and doing rest of world. What do you guys think? Who would do a deal in China right now?
So I have some experience with that. And it's a little bit kind of the if you only have $100 in the bank discussion of based on a difficult program, it was in cell therapy, you had mixed interest around the world without more and more data. And so there's a little bit of, well, as a CEO and as a board, you take the money where you can get it. And so you start getting into this League of Nations thing where you're dividing up the world. And the positive is you can get money from different sources, right? It may not be the biggest numbers, but you're still going, it's cash in the bank. The negative can be if it may be a turnoff to a bigger potential partner who wants the whole world, right? And needs large numbers and these sorts of things. So that discussion revealed that the bigger, I'll say the mid-size and the bigger tier companies, right? So anybody, let's say north of 5 to 10 billion US dollars in annual worldwide sales, were not happy separating US, Europe, China, and Japan. So if you want to do Southeast Asia, you want to do Latin America, totally possible. But once you took out of China, once you took out of Japan, once you took out of North America, once you took out of Europe, the interest levels dropped precipitously. So I don't know what other people think about that, but that's, my N of one discussions.
Who's had experience there?
A lot of people do.
Globally. Globally, yes. I think in terms of the population, in terms of doing the right experiments, I think it's absolutely the right answer. And I think you're right, Ted. It is a way to bring in some money early. It's becoming trickier, right? In a sort of a geopolitical sense. So even with CFIUS and everything else, it becomes trickier. So you really need to do your homework before you consider that. I think is the answer I would say.
The one thing I think about, this goes back to my shearing plow days, we used to sell interferon on behalf of Biogen when Biogen was that big. And what I would call the Biogen approach is try to just fully out-license the first one, keep the cash, and then every other follow-on product, that was then Biogen sales. So all their royalty, their first revenue was royalty revenue from shearing plow.
There's that old Genentech wisdom on that too. It's like you're probably going to have to sell your first baby, then you're probably going to have to sell your second baby.
Definitely maybe, right?
Third or fourth baby you get to keep and raise yourself.
Yeah, once you have that capital base internally that you can deploy as you wish.
Yeah, it's an interesting strategy.
Okay, thank you. Okay, a quick comment. There was a question about updated new orphan regulations. Are they out yet?
They are out. It's probably too late to put the link in the chat. I should have done that yesterday. Sorry. If you look up EU legislation, it came out literally on the 26th. I think was the release date last Thursday or so. But you can look it up. There's some law firms who have given their opinions to to cut to the end of the movie basically is it's a little short on detail and a little long on open questions. What a shock. Can't believe the Europeans did that.
Really?
But you can read it up, and there's a lot, I read a summary from Covington yesterday that was a really nice, short, sweet summary and chopped it up by topic. I know my colleagues are looking at that in Geneva because we have a lot of European clients. So there's there's probably still more questions than answers. It's not all, it's like what Diane was saying about RA. It's not actually all horrible. They're trying to get away from some of the salami slicing on orphan indications that simply got there because it's idiopathic whatever disease, which is what's left after the treatable population. So they're trying to get around some of that and some of the dynamics of people just extending. So I think in many ways there's a lot of things that make sense, but it's not super clear how a lot of it's going to work in reality.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ted. Elizabeth, I have a question for you that may make you happy. It's from an investor who says, since you mentioned that you're involved with a near IND stage company, my question is, what do you think your value of inflection point is? And if you had to raise money from VCs, what data would you raise it on?
Right. So I am raising money from VCs and have some good leads there, but I won't say anything too much. Value points are pretty standard, right? People want to see the animal models if you're not clinical, and the animal models are either good or bad depending on your therapeutic area. So that can be tough. And then if you're early stage after that, then it's your traditional catalyst. I think it's absolutely going to be what does your early clinical data look like? And that's why I say you have to be really careful about how you design those first trials. I've been in the situation where we've done it, say, in like an open arm first check, and that is not a really great starter. But if you do have a controlled trial, even if it's early, I think that's a good value point for investors. If you're not even yet to the point where you have animal models, then I think you have to create that willingness to believe, right? That's the Barbie moment.
Okay. Thank you. I think this pretty much wraps it up. This is all the time that we have for questions. Ted, would you like to do a thank you for your panelists, your great panelists?
But of course, so wonderful panel. Time flies when you're having fun. So thank you, ladies, all for joining me. I hope this was a benefit to the audience. Of course, we can't answer everything because this is a complicated business, but you'll be able, I think you can find all of us on LinkedIn if our info isn't posted on our bio pages, and we'd be happy to follow up with you as necessary. So Sarah, thanks a lot. It's been a great time, and we look forward to the next one.
And a commercial, get involved with bio, get involved with pharma, get involved with No Patient Left Behind, help the industry stay strong.
Right, exactly. We need all the help we can get right now. So thank you all. Before we sign off, I do want to officially thank you again, Ted, for sponsoring this event.
Pleasure.
And I would also like to remind everybody that we have another virtual salon coming up in about 2 weeks. And that salon the title of it is Ignore Candida auris and Emerging Pathogens at Your Own Risk. So it's going to be a heavy one. This salon has been taped. It will be available in a couple of hours. It takes us a while to process it. I will provide all of the speakers with all the questions that we have, and who, you can answer the people that have asked the questions directly, including the one who wants to know if Judy has a direct line to God. Okay, so with that said, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, and that is it. Signing off.
Thanks, Sarah Jane.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.